Hey everyone, this is Scott from CertainMedia.com. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to optimize the Enfold theme. It's a great theme. It's found on Theme4, so you can buy it for $59 a month. If you've already purchased it, you're watching this because you probably ran the test and you got a really poor GT Matrix or a PageSpeed Insights score for your theme. I imported the gaming demo just because I thought it looked good. You can choose whichever demo that you already had on your website, or you can just simply use whatever design you already have. These are just what I imported for the sake of the video. We're going to be going over a couple of important details. First, I'm going to delete all these inactive plugins because they don't really matter, but it'll make it easier for you to keep track. And we're also going to talk about, if you're using WordPress Rocket, I have a video guide on WordPress Rocket on the channel. That is a recommended plugin. It is a premium plugin though, so I'm going to be showing you in this video free plugins that you can use to kind of get the same effect. It's not going to be exactly the same performance-wise, but it'll still be much better than default out of the box. But you can watch the WordPress Rocket video and that'll show you the same configuration. It should work with this without any issue. They have compatibility with this theme, and the other plugin you may want to look at is Perf Matters. It's less important for this theme, but it is another premium plugin on the channel. You can check that video out as well. I'll put both of them in the eye that you can just watch. And if you want to throw down the money for it, you may. But if you want to just go ahead with these free plugins, please feel free to continue. All right, so the Enfold theme has quite a bit of functionality out of the box, which is kind of a slightly annoying feature. So a couple of issues that I just want to point out during the demo installation. I restarted it twice. The menu items got duplicated for some weird reason. That won't really matter too much for performance because none of them are mega menus. And the icons, after trying to re-import them 4 times over, didn't work. So I'm done trying to get their demo process to import correctly. You shouldn't have this issue because your website's already set up. So you have your GT Matrix report, and we can see quite a few things. While I am on Cloudways, I have server-side caching completely disabled. 845 millisecond response time. It is a bulky theme, so that's to be expected. A very large page weight. We have these canceled requests to the fonts, so we're going to ignore those. But our bigger issue is the slow PageSpeed Insights score. And this is a very complicated page layout, which is partially why I chose this demo. It isn't very video heavy, but it has a lot of images. It has a lot of good content, and it would better illustrate what you're probably building on your website than some of the more basic ones. So we need to do a couple of things. First of all, we're going to go over the Enfold theme because there are some options in here that you can change to improve the performance. In fact, funny enough, there's an entire performance section, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing. If the theme has a performance section, that's just screaming for issues. So you can go ahead and enable file merging for theme CSS and theme JavaScript files. That is totally fine. You shouldn't have any issues with this. I click show the advanced option so I can walk you through these. For here, you should just use SSL verification, which is the default. That's totally fine. You can add a unique timestamp for your merged files. I do recommend doing this. For the remove query strings from static resources, I would honestly remove them, but we can do this in a variety of ways. The custom font display property, I actually recommend you, so this will modify both custom fonts and icon fonts. Custom fonts would be you downloaded a font from like any of the font libraries online, you uploaded it and you used it in the Avia builder for your text. What I recommend for general text is to always use font display swap, which means that the browser and the system that it's on will swap to a system safe font, which is just a fancy word for a pre-installed font that's on every computer. And then when the real font is downloaded, it'll swap to display it. So you'll get a flash of unstyled text, but the alternative is a flash of invisible text, which means that no text shows until that font is downloaded, which just isn't recommended. The only thing to keep in mind is that this also swaps icon fonts. So for instance, if these icons were working due to their import process, the Facebook icon that was supposed to be here would swap to a random stray character, and then it would swap to the icon. It shouldn't be a major concern, but it's something you should be aware of when you check the option. The disable template builder elements. Now, By default, it should load all elements always. What this does is it will, when you set it to load only used elements, it will go ahead and scan the page and determine what elements in CSS and JavaScript it needs to load for this page to render correctly. If you get an error, and you probably will, one thing I recommend doing is enabling the scan widgets. This will be more expensive on the server side to run, and as it mentions, please reload the widget page when you finish editing to force a scan of the widgets. It can be a little bit expensive, but we'll add a page caching plugin to help reduce your TTFB, because this should lead to somewhat of an increase. So if you enable it, at first, it's probably going to give you this error, which is completely acceptable. Go ahead and click the edit page. You go ahead and you click the update button, and it should force it to regenerate and determine the assets that it needs to render. This works for most websites, and then that'll restore it. You'll unfortunately have to do this for every page, but one thing to keep in mind is the Avia merge style sheet right here was 73 kilobytes before we ran it, and if I inspect my element, I should be able to determine the new size, and I expect it to be decreased by at least a fairly good amount. Now it's 54.1 kilobytes, so it reduced the CSS by what, 30%, give or take, just by enabling the option and reloading the page. You should honestly take the time and go ahead and just update all your pages to get that performance improvement. That's going to be very important, especially for PageSpeed Insights. PageSpeed Insights will not let you mess around with having unused CSS and JavaScript, because it's a major hindrance on slow mobile CPUs. So we check that option, we check the scan widget. If you're curious about how to do the scan widget functionality, I'll just show you real quick. You go to your appearance, you go to widgets. If you have a widget, you'll just type in, you'll have to make some sort of change. You click save and you reload it, and that will trigger it to scan the widgets to determine what's being loaded and what assets it needs to load on each of the pages that the sidebar is set to render on. You could disable theme features altogether. So let's just go ahead here and describe this. So first of all, the WP Media Element script is basically a WordPress script that's primarily meant to render videos in a player. It's used in a variety of other formats as well. I think it's used for MP3 files as well. More or less, you can leave it at the default behavior to load it only when needed. If you know you're not using any self-hosted video or audio files, you can outright disable it. Or you could just always load it, which is what you really shouldn't do. The only time you'd want to do that is if you have some third-party plugin that's having an issue. You could choose to disable external video features. So if you want to disable the Vimeo and YouTube API, that talks back to their systems. If you're not using any videos, you're safe to go ahead and check this box. This demo, I think, uses it somewhere, so I'm not going to check it. So you just got to keep that in mind. If you don't have a blog, you can disable the blog template builder element and the comments styling and a bunch of other details. If you don't have a blog, I'm just going to say you probably should start one from an SEO perspective. But if you aren't using one now and you don't ever really plan on doing it, just disable the elements. You'll get much faster performance for it. You could disable the emoji and smiley scripts. I recommend doing that. You could disable jQuery migrate, which will work with this theme. However, if you have third-party plugins, and this is where you get into the ifs with a lot of these performance options, if you have third-party plugins, then you're going to probably have some issues, because some do rely on older versions of jQuery. So jQuery migrate fills in that gap. Most websites, though, if they're fairly decent and you're not using any weird plugins by one-off developers that haven't been updated in 3 years, you're safe to go ahead and disable it. I have it disabled on my own website. Now, I don't use this specific theme, but this theme doesn't depend on it. You could choose to load jQuery in your footer. However, loading just moving jQuery to the footer is not a good fix, and I don't recommend checking this option, even though it's better for your performance overall. Here's the reason I don't recommend doing this. Primarily, if you have any third-party plugins, and this is where I say that again, you're going to have major performance issues, and that's just the fact of the matter, because you're going to have errors that will come up. your JavaScript will throw an error like jQuery is not defined. And that's when jQuery is being loaded after or asynchronously before the resource that is requesting it can access it. So the resource, it does not have access to jQuery, but it needs it. So you have to load it in the header. Now, performance plugins, WordPress Rocket, Auto Optimize, we will be using Auto Optimize. They can combine JavaScript. And WordPress Rocket in particular can combine inline JavaScript in a very selective fashion. And that helps alleviate issues where jQuery could otherwise not be loaded in the footer. So just keep that in mind. Don't check this option if you're using third-party plugins because you could easily break something and you may not even know. Your site could render completely fine, but your contact form may stop working and you have no submissions for 3 months, and that could very well be why. The other option I don't recommend doing is loading your Google fonts in the footer. We will be fixing this issue a little bit with Auto Optimize. One other detail is that layer slider is installed and activated. This specific demo does use layer slider for the home page. However, if you do not need layer slider, I highly recommend you disable it because sliders are not good for your performance, frankly not even good for user experience. But this can be disabled relatively easily. Let's see where this is. There is a option within the theme that can just disable the slider altogether. But I do want to show you some other stuff first before I do that now. Under the theme options, number one, if you have the block editor enabled, which means you're not using the classic editor, go ahead and just make sure that this is set to use the block editor. I do recommend enabling that. You have all your nonsense styling options, which I'll go to in another video. Your layout builder, one thing I do want to point out in here is you can choose to disable the advanced layout builder in the backend. This may yield a slightly better performance because this will disable live preview of elements in your backend. But you can also now go in here, and if your theme is not using layer slider, go ahead and deactivate it, but leave the plugin files in the theme folder. There's absolutely no reason to delete all the items in the theme folder. Frankly, I wouldn't recommend doing it. But I would just deactivate it if you're not using it because you don't need those assets loading on all of your pages anyways. And layer slider in particular, while it's not as bad as Revolution slider, it's not as good as something like Smart Slider, which is still more performant. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to hop into the plugins section because free plugins, while they don't do the full job of a premium plugin, you can almost always get some of the functionality just by crossing over and using a couple of them. So we need to, number one, we're going to want to integrate some sort of lazy load. And the best plugin I know to use is Lazy Load Optimize Images, which I've done a video on as well. I'm just going to show you, you're going to install it and you're going to activate it. If you have WP Smush or mostly WP Smush, they have lazy load functionality in there. I recommend disabling it. It's a very simple lazy load and it does miss quite a few images compared to this plugin. So you may actually get better performance with this plugin just by trying it out. So you can just disable it if you have WP Smush and use this instead. And basically you enabled it. And now you can look at data lazy source and it's lazy load 23 images or so. That's pretty good. If we're curious now, just from the few changes we've made, I'll run GT Matrix and I will run a PageSpeed Insights as like a mid-ground where we're sitting. So we started at a 31 on PageSpeed Insights, it's in the other tab. We're running this one. I'm expecting it to go up by a handful of points because we did fix quite a few of the initial issues. So now it's up to a 54. We were at a 31, we went up to a 54 on the mobile test by just loading the assets only when necessary and integrating a basic lazy loading plugin. It does recommend serving images in next-gen formats. You can do this in a variety of ways. If you have Cloudflare, Cloudflare Pro will do that. It also recommends encoding the images efficiently. We can look at that as well. But really the best way is you can use WebP Express. I won't walk you through WebP Express because I have a video on the channel, but it's a free plugin that will convert images to WebP. The only reason I'm not going to walk through it is because it takes a while to run the WebP conversion process, and I just don't want to add that onto the length of the video or have to edit it out. right now, so we have a couple of issues primarily with a serve scaled images. One of them goes to the layer slider, quite obviously, and it's the Enfold gaming header right here. So it wants us to resize that. That can be done easily by just manually doing it. It wants some images to be compressed. Image Optimizer, free plugin that can handle that. We don't have a favicon, but we still dropped substantially. We went from 3.52 megs to 1.56, so we cut the page weight in half on the initial load. Strangely enough, the Y-slow score went down. I wouldn't be too concerned with that. The primary reason it went down is because of the content delivery network warning, it looks like. I believe it just gave it more weight. I wouldn't be too concerned. It also says we have an inline script that could be minified. That was one extra over the previous test. That's nothing to be concerned about. Okay, so the next step we want to do is we're going to throw on auto optimize because it's very efficient, easy to use. A CSS and JS minification plugin. It'll do your HTML as well. You'll go ahead and you'll install this. You can also use, if you want to host your Google Fonts locally, OMGF, which I've also done a video on. Basically, it'll just download your CSS onto your server. For the fonts, it'll download the font files and it'll replace them. Using free plugins can get a little bit hectic because when you have many of them installed, it gets very crazy. But you don't need to worry about these ones that I'm showing you. So for JavaScript, you go ahead and you can enable the JavaScript options, optimize JavaScript code, aggregate JS files. We will try this option right here, which is to disable the merge jQuery. We're going to go ahead and make sure it's enabled for logged in administrators. And I just want to make sure that we don't get any sort of issues with our JS. Okay. So jQuery is not defined, and this is because of the layer slider plugin. So you have to leave it as excluded if you have layer slider. For your optimized CSS, go ahead here, aggregate your CSS files. Do not aggregate your inline CSS because that'll cause the cache size to get very large. And you can enable data URIs for background images. And if you want, you can optimize the HTML code, which will just make the HTML slightly smaller. Not a major concern anymore with HTML minification, but it's an option. Play button's all the way up there right now, but I'm going to toss that up to being the browser rendering. So as you can see right now, we have the CSS in merged. We have one CSS file that looks to be relatively excluded. It's probably a WordPress core CSS style sheet, but your main style sheet should be up here. And we now need to, and we've merged our JavaScript files down to a handful of them. So we'll go ahead and run this again just to show the reduction in the number of requests. This should yield a slight performance improvement. While that's running, I'll show you one thing you can do with layer slider. In your options for a layer slider, number one, if you have any Google fonts, you're gonna need to declare them here for a layer slider. I always get asked about layer slider issues. Under advanced, number one, you could choose to include the script in the footer, but this is already done by the theme. And the conditional script loading is already enforced by Enfold, which means it's only loading on the pages that's absolutely necessary. You can choose to defer the JavaScript for layer slider, but you tend to get some stranger issues when you do this, so just keep this in mind. But we'll go ahead and enable it. Since we're already merging the JavaScript with auto optimize, it doesn't matter too much. And I'm willing to bet our server response time increased. Yeah. Server response time was a little slow this time, but that's fine. The request count went down again. The page size went down again. And we saw a slight improvement here as well. We're still not done though. If you wish on these, you can also edit your sliders relatively easily within layer slider, and you can modify your slider settings. And under the slider settings, number one, if you wish to, you can disable it on mobile if you don't want to have it harassing mobile users, which may be a fairly decent thing to do. However, under advanced settings and you go to miscellaneous, you can choose to enable an enhanced lazy load. So this makes it compromised to ensure max compatibility while offering a solution that works ideally. Basically, It will leave the image source, the source set attributes untouched, which means that the JavaScript will begin downloading those images faster before Layer Slider cancels them. It's really just a compatibility issue. This plugin should lazy load your images out of the box without much issue. One thing I do recommend trying though is allow restarting slides on resize. So if the size of the slider is changed from the device orientation, restarting it on the resize will make it much easier on the mobile users in particular. You can also choose to enable relative URLs, but I don't see why you need to do that. For most websites, you're probably using HTTPS anyways. So now we're gonna hop over to Cache Enabler. Basic free caching plugin for your pages. It basically takes your HTML, saves in an HTML file, and uses, I didn't need to search cache plugin, but it basically just reduces the TTFB by serving a static version of your pages instead of leaving it all up to really WordPress to figure out. You'll activate this. What this does is now whenever somebody goes to your pages, let me hit the permalinks refresh real quick, go to post name. It will not work with the default plain because it does not cache query strings. If you ever need to clear the cache, you can clear it up here. We'll just reload this real quick. Okay, we reloaded this. We're gonna let this test rerun, and I'm expecting the server response time warnings to clear. And one thing to keep in mind about this theme too is one of the slowest items in it is Layer Slider. If you can rebuild your page without using Layer Slider, it's something I highly recommend doing because that extra JavaScript in particular is what eats up the mobile performance on PageSpeed Insights. Looks like our lazy load plugin does not like that play button. It just keeps rotating it off screen during the rendering for some odd reason. And we're up to a 58. So we need to serve the images in next-gen formats and to preload the Layer Slider CSS because it is not loading in a timely fashion. It also wants us to encode our images in an efficient manner. So let's run through EO Image Optimizer because that's the last of the warnings and I figure it'll be useful information to have. EO Image Optimizer is a free image compression plugin. WebP Express is a free plugin to convert images to WebP. They both can do WebP conversion. One thing about EO Image Optimizer though is if you're using something like Managed WP, they will not allow you to use this plugin. You'll instead need to use something like Robin Image Optimizer because this will run the compression on your own hardware. And obviously somebody like WordPress engine isn't really going to want to give you all that CPU power to compress all of your images. You can enable WebP conversion. You can enable the use of the picture tag if you're not using the Apache rewrites. One thing you can do is for WebP images will be generated and saved for all images regardless of their size. So by default, when EO Image Optimizer runs, it will compress your images and it will try the conversion to WebP. But if the WebP image is larger than the already PNG or JPEG image, it will not convert it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We are going to enable the WebP option. You can also convert other images like your PNG to JPEG because frankly, if the image is in PNG but it doesn't have a transparent background, it's just going to get better compression by using JPEG. But we'll go ahead now and we'll run it. It's going to optimize 720 images. Hope it doesn't take too long. Mostly hope that there's a bunch of JPEGs. JPEG images tend to run the compression faster because they are lighter weight and they just are, the PNG compression algorithm that they use is much heavier on the server. So as you can see right here, it will tell you how much your savings were by compressing the image. It'll say no savings or reduced by X%, and it will tell you the WebP reduction, which is how much savings you got from converting that compressed image into WebP. It can take quite a while. I'm not going to sit here and make you watch all of the compression, but the general gist is you let this run in the server. We'll try to serve WebP images to the browser if it determines that it can support them. And I'm hoping to see like one image at least, but I don't think I'm going to get there anytime soon. which is a shame. Really, it's a great plugin. It does its job quite well. One thing I will say though is if you're using the EU Image Optimizer WebP Conversion, you need to keep in mind of one important detail. The WebP Conversion is sort of finicky in this plugin. By default, it will try to use an Apache rewrite, so it'll just add some rules to your htaccess file. If you're on Nginx, obviously that will not work. Now, you could use the JS WebP rewriting, which will use a script which supports background images, which can be enabled in the easy mode tab, but the easy mode tag is just their service, their easy IO service to compress your images on their cloud servers. I don't really recommend it just from the value perspective, but the picture WebP rewriting should be a better fix. One more warning about this specific rewrite though. Picture elements do not apply to CSS background images. Another note is that the picture element, if somebody's styling based on the image tag, this will break those styling because the image tag is no longer an image tag, it's a picture element. So just keep that in mind. Most of you should be fine out of the box just using the standard rewrites. I was hoping to get at least like one image ready, but it looks like they're just loading a very large amount of images. So what we'll do real quick is we'll hop in the media library and I'll show you what a finished WebP image would look like in theory. So you come over to here, .jpg, .webp. Doesn't look like he is loading his WebP variation just yet. This is the joy of using WebP Conversion. It takes so long, but you'll run this, the images will be converted and compressed, and this will clear a couple of warnings. Under PageSpeed, it will clear the optimized images tag. It will not clear the serve scaled images tag. You'll need to manually resize any images that get flagged to these dimensions. It can be done in Photoshop. There's tons of online sites that can do this too. Under PageSpeed Insights, this will clear the serve images in next-gen formats warning. It will clear the efficiently encode images warning. And this should bump you up easily to around a 70 or so. I will say I did test one of their demos. I think it was the small business demo where they didn't use layer slider. And out of the box, it sat close to a 70-ish to an 80-ish. Depending on the test, it always fluctuates a bit. So that's something to keep in mind. Don't use layer slider with this theme if you can help it. Otherwise, continue to use your site as is. These optimizations should tune your site to be a bit faster. One more warning that you're going to get, and it's unfortunate if you're using layer slider, and you'll also get this if you're not using something like WordPress Rocket. Eliminate render blocking resources. Because we're using layer slider, we have to have jQuery as a render blocking resource. Otherwise, the slider breaks. If you don't use that, you don't need to have jQuery in a render blocking fashion, so long as you have no plugins that are dependent on it. WordPress Rocket can also merge inline JavaScript from some plugins, but I believe layer slider is excluded because there is an issue where if it's merged, that inline JavaScript, the slider will not render. Also, while auto-optimize will merge and minify your CSS, the critical CSS functionality in the free version is not good. I would not recommend trying it because you can only use it for a single page. And they have a power-up section, which is you pay them, I think it's like $2 a month. It's super cheap. You pay $2 a month and it will generate the critical CSS for your homepage, your posts, your categories, everything. And that would clear the render blocking issue for the CSS files. WordPress Rocket has this as well. It's called Optimized CSS Delivery, and that would clear those warnings as well. Another note on the preload key request. This is going to be flagged if you use layer slider because layer slider for some reason decides to load its CSS in the JavaScript. So it loads its CSS in their inline JavaScript to go and get it when the slider needs to be rendered at the point that it's found in the HTML. I don't know why they do that. You can use link rel preload to add it, but if you're not using layer slider, you don't need to worry about it. And as for the remove unused CSS in JavaScript, these warnings will always remain, but since we are loading the assets only when necessary, it'll be substantially less than what would have happened if we loaded them on all pages, which was the default behavior. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments below. I'll gladly try to help you out. Otherwise, make sure to check out some of the other videos on the channel. Make sure to like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.